When you talk about wrestlers who have influenced pop culture and wrestling, few have had a bigger impact than Macho Man Randy Savage. Let's bring on Jon Finkel, who's out with a new book, great timing during WrestleMania week, called Macho Man: The Untamed, Unbelievable Life of Randy Savage. John, congratulations on the book. What a colorful character story to tell.
Thank you. I've been wanting to tell it since I was about 5 years old, so I appreciate it.
Well, and you've written other books, but your first love was wrestling. And there have been a lot of books written about Randy. How did you decide to tell this particular story about him?
Yeah, well, there hasn't been there's no book. That's why I was like so
Really?
happy to be able to do it. There was no definitive biography of Randy Savage, nothing, no autobiography back from the 80s or 90s. And so I've had my eye on writing about Randy for as long as I wanted to be an author. So this is my 10th book, and I knew it was going to be like a Mount Everest level undertaking with he's got a whole baseball career. You've got his father who was a wrestler, you've got then his actual wrestling career, his pop culture impact. So it's almost like two or three careers plus his family rolled into one biography. And so I just had it in the back of my mind that it was something I wanted to do. And as I got deeper and deeper into my career as a writer, this was like a bucket list biography, and the time just felt right. And I finally, Lanny, his brother, has passed away now, but I had finally had a connection to get in touch with him and to be able to interview him for this. And once that happened, it kind of got things moving.
So before we get to his wrestling, which is where Jason will get very excited, I want to talk about before that because most people picture wrestlers as being former football players.
Yeah.
You can look back at John Cena, you can look back at The Rock. There's a whole bunch of wrestlers that played football before. Randy Savage is different than that. Then he was a baseball player, and he was a good baseball player. What was it that you learned about his baseball playing career?
Well, the most important thing to know is that this was his dream. Not like maybe you or I played little league and we would wanted to be a major league baseball player. I grew up in Boston, so maybe I wanted to be the left fielder, the next great left fielder for the Red Sox, and it was like in my head it was like okay, it was Jim Rice and Mike Greenwell and Jon Finkel, and obviously that didn't happen. But for Randy, he was there I talked to his entire high school team. I talked to his coaches. I talked to his neighbors, and Randy was the best athlete around. He hit 500 as a junior. Then got some advice that he would be drafted higher if he could switch hit. So he spent his in between his junior and senior years learning how to switch hit. It affected him not at all. He bat 500 again his senior year. Like home runs, RBIs. He was an excellent catcher, and then incredibly for he had his pro day, which what would be considered a pro day now. He came down with the flu towards the end of the season, and had just even his coach now, who's in his 80s, was like he had 100-degree fever, like he shouldn't have been out there, but there was no way to cancel it. He performed terribly, and he ended up not even getting drafted, which was a shock to literally every single person in the town of Downers Grove. Anyone who'd seen him play, this kid had been dominating since Little League, and he ended up going to a tryout for the Cardinals. Out of 300 guys who weren't drafted, they signed one guy that day, and it was Randy the Macho Man Savage.
Well, not only you mentioned the switch hitting or attempted switch hitting, but you told a story in the book about what happened after he broke a collarbone.
Yeah, yeah, that's one of my favorite stories in really in any book I've ever written, because anyone who's played any sport at literally any time, you don't even have to be a good athlete. You just have to have played catch like three times in your life to understand how hard this is. So Randy was clinging to the bottom rung of single A baseball, flirted with double A a little bit, and he had a huge collision at home plate, trying to make everybody's trying to make an impression. They feel like he didn't have a bonus. He was literally making like $200 a week to play minor league baseball. And, they feel like every single play could be a reflection on a coach that says this guy's got hustle and grit, move him up, move him down. He gets a collision at home plate, breaks his collarbone, like strains and bruises a bunch of muscles on his right side of his body, and basically ends his season, which effectively should have ended his career because he's a catcher. He can't throw anymore. Can't throw with his right arm anymore. Randy decides, well, hell, I have two arms, so I'm going to learn how to throw lefty. Now, most of us would just be like, yeah, I mean, you can go outside. My son's 11. When I was researching this part of the book, he was 10. And I was like, let's go grab a bucket of balls. And he plays all the sports. I'm going to throw lefty for a little bit. And as you would know, it's awful and hard and weird. And your feet aren't in the right place. And you've got that chicken arm thing, and you're just not getting the ball to turn over. And I probably threw like 100 balls, and it never felt good. So Randy decided that he was going to do everything left-handed. He decided to brush his teeth lefty, open doors lefty, play cards lefty, drive lefty, and then the piece of like to show his intensity, he decided to throw the baseball 1,500 times a day against his wall near his crappy little condo in Sarasota every single day until he felt comfortable throwing lefty. And over 8 months, he managed to get himself to the point where he threw a passable, decent speed ball lefty. And that brought him back and kind of added another year plus onto his minor league career.
That's kind of the story of his life, which you touch on throughout the book. It's a story of reinvention. He's
Yes.
always reinventing himself, whether it's going from a 6'1", 185-pound baseball player to competing and taking fifth place in Mr. Kentucky as a
Yeah.
body.
Isn't that crazy?
Uh, Talk about kind of that transition into wrestling, which he could have gotten into all along. I mean, his dad was a wrestling star. What did he hold? The Navy push-up or sit-up record?
Yeah, yeah. His dad was a stud. His dad held the world record. Not it was the naval record, which was also the world record for the most consecutive sit-ups. He did 6,033 sit-ups over the course of 4 hours and 10 minutes, which is just he just
Oh,
picked to do it as a 20-year-old. And he was bleeding. And the craziest part is the guy who tried it before him died of a ruptured aortic wall. So this wasn't just something you tried, and if you didn't make it, oh well, it was pretty dangerous. Um, Randy's dad actually played baseball at DePaul University. He was pretty good. He wasn't going to make the pros or anything, but he was a good ball player until he got injured. So baseball was in the family. Sports were in the family. Their mom, Judy Popo, was on the diving and swimming team at DePaul also. So they were used to, they were around athletes. And when he grew up, it was baseball. His dad loved baseball too. They built a batting cage on the side of the house. He had a tire hanging from a tree that he would swing 1,000 times a day to try to strengthen his forearms and wrists. And so baseball was what he wanted to do. But to your point of what you guys said earlier about all these big, when you look at the wrestlers, especially of that era, they were used to being the big men in their school, the big men in town, whether it's Hogan or Andre the Giant or Big John Studd or even, Ted DiBiase, Million Dollar Man, or even Tito Santana. These guys were football players, like you said. They were used to being big, tough guys. People looked at them. They were the guys in high school who did wrestle. They were the guys who did play football, who even went on to college in some cases and played football. So they had the build. It was a very natural crossover to go from playing a fullback or offensive guard or linebacker to jumping in the ring. But Randy had spent, 15 years honing his body as a baseball player. So he had to not only decide when he decided to go into the ring to come up with, learn how to wrestle, which he had some background from his dad, but really to learn how to be a worker. He had to also transform his entire body. Even, Cody Rhodes, a big superstar now, his dad, Dusty Rhodes, first saw Randy right when he transitioned over from baseball. And he's had a quote that I dug up from 1974 where he's like, he has some talent, but he's a string bean out there. Like he looks like a little kid going against, 6'2". Even his brother Lanny at the time was already 6'2", 235, 240. So Macho had to go an incredible physical transformation in a very short amount of time.
You mentioned in baseball that he had this amazing work ethic. Obviously, that helps when you're trying to transform your body.
Yeah, he says, in the way he quotes, some of the early quotes in the '70s are like he says, "I took up weightlifting with a religious fervor," and he did. Lanny and a lot of the guys around him, especially from his territory days, those are listed in the territory days, or like the local outfits where they were like, no, I'm not calling them the minor leagues in the sense that that's what they were, but in terms of the big picture of how wrestling worked, they were local territories, and they kind of either got poached or fed up to the WWE, even though they weren't affiliated. And so Randy lifted constantly. I mean, he was eating like he was following the early '70s Arnold Schwarzenegger bodybuilder diet, steak, steroids, and eggs, right? Like as much as you could probably get. And this is, again, they made it very clear, and even the writings about it in the '70s. Steroids were not illegal until later. When they were legal, he swears up and down that he stopped. He even went on Arsenio and says he stopped. But in the early '70s, Arnold did them, Lou, all the bodybuilders did them. And so he used that regimen to just get jacked. And as you mentioned, he competed in a few bodybuilding competitions. But the problem he had with the bodybuilding competitions was he had to keep his body fat down, which kept his weight down. So he was getting, yoked, but he'd be 195 or 202. And he knew he needed to get upwards of 220, 230. And so he lifted constantly all day and night, and to the point of where he used to drive, he'd have a show at night and they would drive overnight to get back to his favorite gym the next morning to train where he wanted to train.
Did you find that he was insecure about that kind of operating in the land of giants? I mean, if you watched wrestling, he would come to the ring, he'd have these big robes, sometimes he'd have hats on, all things to take away the attention from his size. When he would twirl around, he would stand on his kind of tippy toes to do it. Is that something that he was very conscious of in that era?
Absolutely. That was his entire, like half of his gimmick was to make up for the fact that he wasn't the size of Hulk Hogan, who was his arch rival. He wasn't even close to the size of someone like Ultimate Warrior. Um, I found all these old interviews with the guy who was his stylist, this guy Michael Braun, who made all of his hats and the tassels, and he says the entire ethos of the outfits were to take up space. And the reason, you're 100% right, the reason he moved around and twirled is because if you just look at him, and we were kids growing up, so we didn't even care or think about it. But like as an adult, if he's just standing flat-footed talking to Mean Gene Okerlund, it's like he's just a guy. I mean, he's goofy, he's wearing all the colors and stuff like that, but he's not a giant man. Even in the famous Mega Powers handshake and the is flexing next to Hogan, he's not a giant human being. So he was very much self-conscious about being in the ring with these guys and making sure he could take up space. And he really did a great job of that, of making up, more, taking up more room than he likely should have. The only matches, as I researched this book and am now an adult and understand what 220 really looks like. 6 foot 220 is a big human being. The matches in WrestleMania against Ultimate Warrior, he actually, it's jarring how small he looks in that one. Somehow he took up more space against Hogan. Warrior was just such a phenom. He was 6'3" or like 275, 280. And when he ragdolls Macho, it looks like he's throwing out his little brother. But yes, you're 100% right. He was very much self-conscious about that.
I'm curious about the development of his character as a result of that. It was his personality that sold things as much, the catchphrases. I mean, his influence on pop culture later. But his teammates in baseball were shocked by that. They didn't realize that Randy Poffo was the Macho Man Randy Savage. Can you talk about the transformation from kind of laid back baseball player to intense Macho Man?
Yeah, it's really funny because when you're interviewing these guys, even when you find interviews in the moment from the 70s just about games and stuff like that, most of them will be like, you can't ask like, what was Macho Man like in minor leagues? The answer is always there was no Macho Man. There was just a guy named Randy who was trying to make, Major League Baseball. He was intense and hardworking and incredibly soft spoken and not the center of attention and not bombastic. And he wasn't, the cut up of the locker room. He wasn't the leader of the locker room. He just wanted to play baseball. And so a lot of them, they must have over the years, I know they've all been interviewed for various things, especially when he passed away, but like they referred to Macho Man, like in the movies when they refer to like the Incredible Hulk as like the other guy, like he's the other guy. They didn't play baseball with Macho Man. They played baseball with Randy. And so when he was trying to create this character or a character, he kind of ran in just the opposite direction of who he used to be. He was in minor league baseball. There was, he had to be clean shaven for the most part till the very end of his career. He had to have short hair. Kind of had to blend in, just get in line. And the second he got into wrestling, that facial hair, beard, giant crazy hair, and he wanted to make a name for himself. And so the way he wrestled was wild. And Ole Anderson, said you'd wrestle like a savage, and that kind of made sense for them because he and Lanny, his brother, wrestled together a lot. And if they had the same last name, people obviously knew they were brothers. So they could make more money if people thought they were rivals, Randy Savage and Lanny Poffo. And so the wrestling like a savage is how the Savage name came about.
All right, talk to us about the planner. I mean, everybody talks about the WrestleMania 3 match with Ricky Steamboat. If you watch it as a kid, you and I are the same age, you remember the match, then you look at it as an adult, the whole thing, 160 moves were memorized. They didn't call that in the ring, which
Yeah.
was different at the time than how matches were wrestled. Can you talk about Randy Savage, the perfectionist?
Yeah, that's exactly what he was. The funny thing is, when I'm talking to other wrestlers from that period who were in the locker room with him and, prepared for matches with him, it was very different. The idea of planning every second, and it was crazy. A lot of the older guys, Georgie Animal Steel, one day A funny story, Randy's fighting George the Animal Steel, whose character was basically a Neanderthal Forrest Gump, right? I mean, he walks up to George, who'd been wrestling for like 30 years, and gives him basically like a move list. Like, here's what we're gonna do. Here's a couple of pages, and George looks at him. George at this point is in his 50s, had been wrestling, old school for 30 years. Looks him in the eye and goes, "Yeah, this looks great." Tears it up and walks away, right? And Savage is a new guy, so he's no cachet. He doesn't do anything. But a lot of the guys kind of were like, just get it. This is how we do it here. Don't worry about being a perfectionist. But what ended up happening was, especially after that WrestleMania match, they guys started understanding the value of doing a little more planning. So some of the guys would say, like, if you were wrestling Hogan or Mr. Wonderful or one of these guys, you'd have a 2 or 3 minute conversation before, we're going to come out to this, and in the middle we'll do this, and we're going to finish on this. Randy, those conversations were notorious for being drawn into 25, 30 minutes, 45 minutes. But once the boys in the locker room saw the reaction and that it worked, a lot of them became amenable to it.
Eventually he becomes the old guy, and wrestling decides to kind of toss him aside, and he
Yeah.
decides that his career isn't over. What did you take from the fact that he was not willing to accept that, maybe his time was done?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't. He was right. He was very much right. Especially I mean, if you follow wrestling now, you've got guys like LA Knight and Cody Rhodes and The Rock's in the ring and Roman Reigns. These guys are all over 40 or very late 30s. So the idea that Randy was just done at 40 or 39 was silly. It didn't make, he had some injuries like everybody else, and maybe he wasn't, maybe there was, he lost a foot on his elbow drop off the top rope or whatever it was, but he was far from being just done. And he believed that he was ready to compete and still go through it. But, Vince wanted, Shawn Michaels and, Bret the Hitman Hart. And he had this whole next plan of he's going to phase out the old guys. And that's what he did. And, Macho had a pretty good run at WCW for people who that's like for us, like a lot of people aged out right around then. And I say aged out, and people, there's this thing that I've noticed through wrestling where, like, a lot of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s, maybe plus or minus 10 years of where I am, really got into all of it. And then, high school and girls and your own high school sports, and you kind of just, you fall out of it for a little bit. And then for that generation, my generation, we all got sucked back in college with The Rock and the Attitude Era and Stone Cold. And then another lull when we had little kids and didn't have time. And now my kids, my son's 10, 11, and now we're back into it on that. So it's kind of just been this cyclical thing. And yes, there's a certain percentage of people who just a straight line, never leave and love it all the time. But Randy, for a lot of us, that WCW run, not that he was done, but like when he started appearing more so in Slim Jim and started appearing in other things, people had to remember that he wasn't done actually. So he was right. It would have been cool if he was able to do a lot of that in the WWE.
He wasn't only not done. You talk about that he had an FU list a mile long.
Yeah, that was what his brother said. Yeah.
So what does that mean? Who exactly, or how did you get on that list?
Randy, from what Lanny had explained it to me, like, the proverbial chip on your shoulder forever, right? Macho was, when you're that intense, you need to be driven by some kind of inertia. And Macho believed, probably rightly so, that when he was champion in the WWF, he was never fully given the reins. They never let him pin Hogan. Hogan was sort of overshadowing all his biggest moments, and it's even more egregious when I watch it now. Like, it's actually irritating that they didn't just every match that he had where he was supposed to be his moment, his moment of glory and all these things. Hogan, this big dude, is right there sweating on him and hogging the spotlight. And even on the issues where he would be on the cover of WWE magazine, like there'd be an 8-page spread on Hogan. So that list of people who either had spited him or he felt weren't on board with when he was supposed to be the A player with the company.
Well, and you mentioned Slim Jim. I mean, separate from his work in the ring, his impact on pop culture and the economic impact. I think I've seen Eric Bischoff say that his salary was basically covered by the Slim Jim sponsorship when he came over. So,
Yeah.
I mean, and to this day, if you listen to wrestling podcasts, Slim Jim is back advertising, and
Yep.
they're still using his vocals of the Snap It to a Slim Jim. So all these years later that he's passed away, he still is impacting people who never saw him step foot in the ring.
Yeah, I mean, my son, when I first been out was doing the book, and he watched all, the best part about this for me was like bringing him all the way back. We watched all the WrestleManias together and all the Piper's Pits on YouTube and all the matches and all those things. But he originally was like the Slim Jim guy, even because you go into a 7-Eleven and there's still the Macho Man Slim Jim container and all these things. And yeah, like you said, LA Knight and Bianca Belair now are the next, torchbearers of the Slim Jim Snap Into It. But Randy has a spot in there, and that really is one of the reasons that he was able to resonate all the way through now. Not just the memes and not just the the YouTube videos that people go on and look through, but when he was doing Slim Jim, while other wrestlers may have been either out of the public spotlight or really were only seen on Raw or SmackDown, he was seen 15 times a game during a football game, right? I mean, you couldn't watch the NFL back in the 90s without Slim Jim commercials wall to wall. Same with baseball. He would be at NASCAR events because remember there was a Slim Jim car. So it very much kept him in the public eye far beyond almost any other wrestler around, even Hogan at that time.
Before I get to the last chapter on sort of how he ended up finding Serenity, one of the interviews in the book that stood out was Mr. Wonderful's son, Paul Orndorff, who had a different view of Randy Savage as a child in the business. Can you talk
Yeah.
about the Randy Savage that he saw as opposed to what we saw as fans?
Yeah, it's huge. As an author, I know I was looking. You guys had my man Lazenby on a while ago, and there's no one digs like that man. There was never going to be an 800-page Macho Man book like his Magic book, and he's just on another level of. I don't know how he does it. I've talked to him. I had him on my Books and Biceps newsletter. He's just a machine and very impressive and one of my favorite writers. And he'll tell you probably the same thing that the reason you do that, and I did do that with Macho. Just he's just like I said, he's like an encyclopedia of researching these things. Is that your best interview is almost always going to come from somebody you did not have on your radar when you started writing these books. It's just every single time, every book I've ever done. It doesn't matter the biggest names you line up before you're doing your book proposal. You're putting together your wish list and your hit list, and maybe you have 200 names or 300 names, and you start going through them. But none of them will ever have the impact of that rare random person who comes through somebody else and somebody else. And so through a random conversation with one wrestler to another wrestler who said, you should probably, the end of all these interviews, any young journalism students, the last question you always ask someone when you're writing a book for an interview is there anyone else I should talk to? Is there any story I'm missing? That is where you pull the threads for the next story. And one of those questions, which is just a standard, comes out of my mouth just when I've been thinking about it when I'm doing these interviews. Someone was like, Paul, Mr. Wonderful's son was around a lot. I wonder if you could get a hold of him. Like he's one of the only kids I remember just, one of the Paul Orndorff was one of the only dads who had a kid that age who just kind of let him be around. Twitter was his son was posting for him, and through a couple different DMs, we got in touch, and it was the coolest interview, like you said, and it really may be in the whole book because picture you're 9 years old, it's 1984, 85. Your father is kiss your bicep, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. Your father's close buddies are Hulk Hogan and Macho Man and Andre the Giant. And so your dad goes to wrestle and you go on a bus afterwards, travel with him, and you're walking past Junkyard Dog and Tito Santana, your heroes. And one of the guys in the back was always Macho Man, always sat in the back. He was kind of, not grumpy, but just kept to himself. He was a thinker, as a lot of them said. And early on, that they would send Travis's, and they would send his son over to like mess with him. And he did the what's on your shirt, Macho? You got something on your shirt. This is an 8-year-old kid. Macho growls and looks down. The kid hits boop, hits him in the nose, and everybody, the whole bus is like staring. And Macho laughs and gives him a hug, and they became like friendly. He said he was the only wrestler who talked to him and didn't just pat him on the head and hey bud, like he talked to him about his life and what he wanted to do, and he stayed in touch with him as he went through high school and made sure he didn't go into wrestling, and that was just one of the coolest stories, and one of the through lines, especially through the second half of the book, is just how great Macho was with kids and how much he was open at any time in his career, peak of fame, out of the public eye, to do things for kids.
For as volatile as his life and career was at times, you titled the last chapter Serenity and the peace that he ultimately found through all the struggles that he went through. Can you talk about the place he got to before his passing?
Yeah, there's like a physical manifestation of his just acceptance. There's a, when you write these books, you kind of become like a pop psychologist on someone's life. And I think that the period before that, which I call, dark macho, where it's like he's still trying to wrestle at the very end of WCW. He obviously can't climb up the ropes anymore. His knees are bad, his hips are bad. He's pushing 50. He looks all bloated up from whatever he's on. He's trying to be a tough guy with the hair slicked back, but it doesn't land. Even Lanny says, he just surrounded himself with gimmickry because he couldn't do it anymore. And so he very much didn't. He wasn't confident and comfortable that he had achieved what he wanted. I don't believe he understood the impact he had on a generation. I think he was so consumed with staying relevant that he didn't realize he was sort of already immortal. He could have just stopped. And so he finally did, and he met a long ago, girlfriend from when he was in the minor league baseball. They hadn't talked in 25 years, and reconnected with her. And talking to Lanny and some of the people who saw him around town as he moved out of the public eye. He used to live in a prominent high rise in Tampa, right on the water. He'd go on his deck and have a cup of coffee, and people be shouting "Macho, Macho, snap into it," all that stuff. To he moved into a secluded area. I drove up there. It's impossible to find. It's like a road that says "Do not disturb," and then a "Beware of dog," and then another road, and then there's houses in the middle of the woods. And my daughter and I drove up until she finally was like, "Dad, you can't. We really we don't want to get really trouble up here." And he didn't even live there anymore. I think his ex-wife or his wife, who his wife who's still alive, lived there. And he let himself be. He finally got it. And even Lanny explained, you could tell because he stopped going to the tanning beds. He stopped dyeing his hair. He stopped being he was very obsessed with losing his hair and his bald spot, and would grow his hair down super long in front just so he could pull it over the bald spot and a ponytail and back. And you saw all the later pictures of him, almost like Santa Claus. He had white hair and white beard. His skin was healthier. It wasn't that tanned red, even though it was still, from 30 years of doing that. He'd put on a little weight. He wasn't trying to look, jacked anymore. And we got close to a comeback. He had seemed like maybe mended fences with WWE. Let him shoot a commercial there. He did a promo that's pretty famous on YouTube now about these action figures and this video game that was coming out. And then right around there, he passed away. But he at least, it seems like he had understood. He started to accept that he was the icon that he always wanted to be, and there was that second coming that he would, that second act that we and he obviously were robbed of.
Well, you can read about that icon yourself. The book is Macho Man, The Untamed, Unbelievable Life of Randy Savage. Jon Finkel, appreciate the time. Wish you the best of luck with the book, man.
Thank you. Yeah, everybody go get it. We are in a head-to-head battle with Becky Lynch. Follow wrestling.
Yeah.
The man versus the Macho Man. Autobiography versus biography. So go get it. Let's see if we can take her down.
She got a pretty big machine behind her. I hope you
Yeah, well, that's why we're doing all this, right? We're in the true Macho Man. We're going to persevere in true Macho Man fashion.
They'll probably plug that when she comes in at WrestleMania. So
Yeah. I'm sure that look, there's no harm in giving it your best shot. We've actually been pretty close for a little while, but yeah, I mean, it's tough when every other day it's Seth Rollins says, and then Cody wants, and but we've got some big support coming in too from our side. So
if you want to know where Becky Lynch and Seth Rollins came from,
yeah,
you read the Macho Man Randy Savage book.
Seth Rollins is a direct descendant from performance side of the Macho Man. I think he would even say so. All of these guys owe him, LA Knight is, he owes almost half of his charisma to what the Macho Man did and does, and coming up with all his sayings like the Macho Man did. All these guys, The Miz openly has said they all looked up the Macho Man. Jericho looked, I mean, they all did. They all came up watching him. And so he resonates, man. He's the one that he deserves a lot of credit.
Thanks so much, Jon.
Thank you, guys.
That was a blast.